All right, sorry last week for the last minute cancellation. The roads were iffy and they were saying they were gonna get worse, and it was like, gosh, we hate to cancel, but yeah, we just said, no, we'll just play it safe. So how that will affect us, I'm not exactly sure. I gotta get with their Father David and figure out how we trim down. I don't know if we can actually add on meat, but we'll let you all know what we're gonna do. I mentioned that you're gonna hear me say for different mysteries, different sacraments. This is the main one. Here's another main one tonight. Tonight we're talking about what's often called holy orders, which is kind of a weird name. Um, it's the same root as we get ordination. Um, but basically it is the sacrament of the forming, the naming of clergy. And why do I say it's the main one? It's because without this one, you don't get the other ones, right? The Eucharist is the basic one in the Eucharistic liturgy that many other sacraments take place in. It's the initiation, or sorry, it's the feeding of the Christian. Baptism obviously is the initiation, so that gets the main one. It's sort of the definition of a Christian is what it means to be baptized. Ordination is a little bit different because it's one of the ones that relatively few people themselves experience, right? Relatively few people become ordained, and yet Orthodox Christians, it's pretty fundamental that there's somebody in your life that has gone through ordination as part of holy orders. So it's one that when the majority of people will receive in a secondary way, not in a primary way. Marriage is also another one where, although most people statistically married, not everybody is, and so they're not necessarily essential, obviously, for the person. But ordination is, I would say, one of the rarest ones, or the rarest one, in terms of people actually experience it in a primary way. However, as we're going to talk about, it's absolutely central to the life of a Christian, and that's because throughout the Bible and throughout the history of the church, what we've seen is that God always works with his people, but almost always works through some people to be with his people. In other words, he rarely is dealing with his people directly. We believe we're always in communion with God, but in terms of communication, leadership, structure, open communication, those things tend to happen with relatively few people that stand on the one hand as representatives of God to the people, but also represent the people to God. Moses goes to the mountain to plead for the people. All right, the whole idea of a priesthood in the Old Testament and the New Testament is that you have somebody not as intercessor because you can't go to God, but because you want somebody who's going to speak on your behalf. So the prophets fulfill this role. They speak for God and the people, and to the people for God. So it's God has always used people, and it's not the only way that God uses people, but it is the way of the official leadership of the church. And we'll talk a little bit about official leadership and unofficial leadership as we get into this a little more. Like all the sacraments, all the mysteries, they're rooted in Christ. Christ comes, and one of the first things he does before he does almost anything else is he recruits his disciples, and he's recruiting them and then educating them for the express purpose of someday he's going to send them out, and that's when they're known as apostles. You hear them use this term interchangeably, but their first disciples, which just means learners, and then later on they're referred to as the apostles, because that's when they are sent. Same root here as post office, or what is sent. It's posted. You post it online. We still say you post it online. They become the learners. Then they're the ones that go out, and they're sent to do what? To do the same thing that was done for them, to disciple others. And so the cycle of what God does for his people continues. We do believe it's from God, but as most of the ways that God works with us, it's through other people. And so everything that is done through the ordination, all that the clergy do as bishops, priests, and deacons, we'll get into what those are distinctly, all is for the education and formation of the people in their journey with God. All right. I don't know if we've mentioned this before, but in many ways, Pentecost is seen as the beginning of the church. You have the disciples before Pentecost, they're learning from Jesus. Then he says to them that after he ascends, to go to Jerusalem and wait for the Holy Spirit to come. They do that, and then it's after that, it's after the Holy Spirit comes, that they're then sent out as the apostles. That's the transition, when the Holy Spirit comes. So another way of seeing that, what happens in holy orders is not just God sort of setting his agents and then saying, okay, you go do this work now. God continues to do his work because God continues to operate in the church in many ways, principally through the clergy. It doesn't mean that God doesn't work directly with everybody. God does work directly with all of us. The other idea of the sense of orders is that God is bringing order to the church through the hierarchy. This is the official leadership. What does leadership always do? They bring structure, they help establish goals, they keep people working together, all those things about cooperation, trying to maintain good order in the community. That's what the clergy are called to do. So inaugurated at Pentecost, this idea of priesthood tends to have the idea of you have God, and the way priesthood often works in religion in general is that you have a priesthood because you need the priest to be the one that interacts between you and God. So the priests are traditionally, and in general, across religions, they're the link. Now, we have this same idea in Orthodoxy. The only thing we're going to say is that it's not a division, it's actually a connection. That the idea or the goal, I would say, of the priesthood is not to stand between God and the people, but to be the connector. That's the purpose. What's the purpose of the clergy? Priesthood in general, not just priests, but priesthood in general, is to actually connect God with his people, not to stand in between. That's where the priesthood in the Christian life is different than pretty much priesthood in any other religion. That they're there in Christianity to be the connection between God and the people. Now, who in our theology is the main connector between God and his people? Jesus. Right. So Jesus is the priest. Right? If you go and look at our letterhead, you're going to see that I am the priest of St. Nicholas. That's actually, that might be legally true. It might be referring to me as the priest of this church, but the actual priest of this church is Jesus Christ. He's the high priest. He is in many ways the only priest, because without him as the priest, my priesthood could actually divide and separate people from God. That's the opposite of my job. My job is to actually connect people to God, but not through me. Right? The clergy are there to connect everyone to Jesus, who is the connection, literally in his body, uniting humanity with divinity. So you can see the fact that Christ is the central revelation of God. We've talked about that every time, that he's the main revelation, that God is the Lord has revealed himself to us. He's the main revelation. And what is he revealed to do? To be the unification between God and people. Therefore, if there is a priest, I'm only a priest inasmuch as Jesus is the priest and I work in support of his priesthood. That make sense? Any questions on that? Yeah.
So one of common Protestant concerns is what is the need for the priesthood then? Like when we could just directly go to Jesus if he's the connection.
So you can, right? I am not the connection. Jesus is the connection. Right? But if there isn't something, I don't say me personally, but if there is no earthly organization that's going to order this connection, what's everyone going to do?
Yeah.
They're going to do what the best that they can think to do, right? And with the best of intentions, and sometimes they'll hit it right, and sometimes they won't. But either way, without order, and this is just in general, without order, what do you have? Chaos. Okay, so the idea is that the clergy are there to order, not to stifle, but to bring order so that he can stay central. Right? Because if there's chaos, if we're going to as sort of all equals and everyone with no authority, we're gonna have to discuss and decide everything. That may happen in some ways. You'll see that's actually that conciliar nature is still in the church. But if everybody is at that same level, then in a sense you can have chaos. What you can't do when there's chaos, though, is keep Jesus clearly as the center. So the idea is that the clergy are there to bring order, to connect people to Jesus, who is the connection between them. Good question. Anybody else? All right. Where do we see clergy develop, at least in the New Testament? Well, the first place you see the church develop really is in the Acts of the Apostles. So you have the Gospels, which are primarily the story of Jesus, and obviously the disciples figure prominently in the story, but it really is the story of Jesus. What you see in the book of the Acts of the Apostles, some people call it the fifth gospel, because it reads like the other four gospels, only the character in the story doing what the apostle or doing what Jesus did in the other four gospels is now done by the apostles. So Peter and John are walking through, and the people would come and put the people, they'd line up to 6 so the shadow of Peter could fall on them to be healed. So what Jesus was doing in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, now Matthew, Mark, not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but the 12 disciples, now the apostles, do the same thing. What are they doing? They're teaching, they're healing, they're preaching the kingdom, they're bringing people to belief and faith in God. So in a sense, the revelation of the clergy as one of the primary ways that God reveals himself, you see it in the Acts of the Apostles. You can actually see the development of what we end up with in the New Testament. So you're going to see, and we'll get into this in a little bit, about how the refinement of what the orders are in holy orders. It starts out with one thing, and then by the end of the New Testament, you actually have what we still have in the Orthodox Church. We'll get to that in a minute. So you see it in the Acts of the Apostles. You see it in the writings of St. John. You see it in the writings of St. Paul. They all talk about, well, they refer to at least 2 groups. So they talk about the episcopi, that's the plural. All right, so use your SAT prep. Scope means what? What does a scope do? A telescope or a microscope that helps you see. Okay. What does epi mean? Upon or over. Okay. It's what's on top of. So what are the bishops? They are the overseers. They're the ones that watch over. So in terms of authority in the Christian church, as received and then lived still in Orthodoxy, the bishops, the episcopal rank, they're the overseers. They're the highest authority. We'll talk about authority in a little bit, about how authority works. So as the overseer, of course, who is over the church? Christ. Christ is the head of the church. The bishop is going to function in a visible way, acting as Christ acted. And we don't say he is Christ. The bishop is not Jesus. The bishop is not perfect like Jesus. The bishop is not the he's not a copy of Jesus, but he's an image. So in the bishop, you have an image of Christ, visible, someone you can hear, someone you can get to know, a real person that we can interact with that does reflect to us who Jesus is, right? So he's the overseer, that's the authority. What is his job? His job is to make Christ present to the community. All right, how does he do that? Jesus comes, and what does he do to his 12 disciples? What does he do for them? What's his purpose with them? What's his activity? What do they call him more than anything else? Teacher. He's a teacher. Okay. So Christ is the teacher. What does a teacher do? A teacher teaches. The teacher takes a body of not just information, but of knowledge, of perspective, of wisdom, and says, I have this and I want to transmit it to you. So the teaching, we talked about this if you were in the class last fall, but if not, in the Nicene Creed, lost my train of thought. Where are they going? Nicene Creed. I can't remember where it went. It may come back. But the idea is, what does the teacher do? The teacher imparts something, but the idea is not for the teacher, what's his goal? His goal is to teach the students so that he doesn't need to, that they don't need him to continually be the source. In other words, he wants to transmit something. All right. The teacher, Christ the teacher, came to do what? To reveal the Father to everybody. The bishop, his job then is to reveal the teacher to the people. Only now the teacher is Christ. So who's the bishop revealing? The bishop is the image of the Christ who is no longer physically present, still present through the Holy Spirit, but his job is to represent, we talked about this a little bit, to represent Christ. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that he is Christ? No, he's there to present again the person of Christ. That's his main job, which is the main function of the bishop is to be the teacher. And his main subject, so to speak, is so that the people can know Christ. All right, so in the New Testament, we hear a lot about the episcopacy. We hear initially about what we're going to end up as a third rank. It's often introduced in the group as the diaconate, the deacons. So we have bishops in the early writings of the New Testament, and we have deacons. The deacon, that actually is a very technical word. If you look at the word in Greek, diakonos, the diakonos is a servant, but he's a very specific servant. We would call him today a waiter, which is really interesting because you might not see this too often in real life, but in old movies, what does the waiter have on his arm? Like a cloth, right?
Like a white French apron or something.
Yeah, some kind of cloth, Not unlike how the deacons today still have a cloth that when they're not holding it up, rests on their arm. So there's a connection. The deacon is the waiter. What was his main function? His main function was to help distribute the gifts of the Eucharist at the Eucharistic liturgy. He was there to help distribute. So he's a waiter, he's a servant. He works at the behest of the bishop. He works at his direction. He is not independent. Okay? Now later on in the New Testament, you start to get one other rank that you don't see early on. And that's the rank that in Greek is the presbyteros, we would say in English as the presbyter. And that's the word that often gets translated in English as the priest. It's actually not a great translation. Right? Technically, if we follow the original meaning of my rank of the whole of holy orders, we typically would not translate that in priest in the way that this has traditionally been understood, at least in English. The word actually means, anybody know?
Elder.
Elder. What's an elder? What's the function of an elder in a community?
Wisdom.
Yeah, he's somebody who's been around a little longer, right? Elder, older, it's not accidental, there's a connection there. He's been around a while, he knows a little more, he can assist and teach, he can help organize, right? He's one that respect is given to, we would ideally respect our elders. This later development, the way we understand this is you have in some ways two very different role. You have an episcopal role, which is very different than the diaconal role. This idea of a presbyter, one of the reasons why we think this develops still pretty early, right? You're talking about between 50 AD and let's say 100 AD, the time that the epistles are being written. Already this is developed. By the end of the New Testament writing, you already have this firmly in place. It's already there. So you have a threefold. And what is the presbyter's main job? And that is that when the overseer is not there, he sends the presbyter, he sends the elder to do what? To do everything he would have done, but can't do when he's not in their presence. Now you see this pretty clearly. Actually, you will see it, God willing, in 3 weeks. Right? So not this Sunday, but 2 Sundays later. Or maybe 3 Sundays later. Anyway, on February 23rd, I think it is. Bishop John, God willing, is going to be here. All right. Watch during the liturgy, the whole thing, but keep half an eye on what Father David and I do. What you'll notice is we do next to nothing. And actually, a couple things that you're going to see us do, it's only because the bishop is a nice guy, and he says, you guys have been standing here a long time. He'll tell the deacon at some point, don't go out and do your litany. He'll say, Father Michael, Father David, you do those petitions. Why? He's being nice, because when the bishop is here, there's very little role for the presbyter. Why? Because my main job is to be his presence when he's not here. So when he's here, there's really nothing to do. And you'll see it played out liturgically, that liturgy. What you kind of see, especially from the end of the Testament, then going out later on, is that these presbyters, these elders, are going to form, and actually you'll hear this in the writings of Saint Ignatius. If you want to do some really interesting reading in early church writing that's not the Bible, you can look up the letters of Saint Ignatius. All right, Saint Ignatius is traditionally the child that Jesus calls and says, unless you become like a little child, you can't enter the kingdom. That's tradition. Whether it's true or not, we don't know. But we know that historically, he is a very, very old man around the year 100. And he has been arrested by the Romans. He's being taken to Rome to be tried. And he writes 7 letters to churches that he was over as an episcopos, as a bishop, telling his people, don't stop this from happening. This is very important. I know what I'm doing. Please don't stop it. He actually says, I'll paraphrase, I go to be ground by the lion's mouth like the wheat is ground into flour, to be offered up to be a loaf of bread offered to the Lord. That's his image of his impending martyrdom being chewed up by the lions. Our tradition about his martyrdom is that he was so consumed by the lions that all that was left was his heart. And that on his heart was inscribed the name of Jesus Christ. Now, tradition, you can choose to believe it or not, but anyway, why am I talking about that? Because he talks about the fact that the bishops, with their priests, in a very similar order as Christ with the apostles, right? He teaches them, then he sends them out. It's the same way. St. Ignatius, again, writing in just the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, says that's how you understand the priesthood, that they gather around the bishop, just as the apostles gather around Christ. And they are, in a sense, the council of the elders around Christ. Now, this next little part I'll talk about, it's not something you necessarily have to believe or understand or even agree with, but I think there's something unique in this. I just want to make that little caveat that this is one way of understanding these 3 orders. Anytime you have 3, of course, there is a possible connection with the Trinity. So a rough approximation of the roles of the bishops, priests, and deacons, presbyters, and deacons. One of the ways we can understand their roles, and it's just one, and again, it's not a mandatory, but I think it's interesting to think about, is that in some ways, the bishop is not only the image of Christ, in many ways, he's the image of the Father. In our theology, we won't get into this much now. We did a little bit last fall, and if you take that class next fall, we'll talk more about it. But the idea of our theology is that the Father, obviously, in our theology, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are 3. They're united. They're not separate. They're united, but they're distinct. But the Father is the source of both the Son and the Spirit. Both come from him. In a similar way, the bishop is the source of both the presbyters or the priests and the deacons. Now that's practically one way we see that is it takes a bishop to ordain a priest or a deacon. So they literally have their source, deacons and priests have their source in the bishop. But another similar sort of analogy is that in many ways the bishop is an image of the Father. And what does the Father do? The Father sends the Son. And what does he send the Son to do? To represent him. To teach what he learns from the source. To be the express image of the Father. That's how St. Basil describes him. And to be the presence in the midst of the people. In the at least perceived absence of the Father. So Jesus comes to show us the Father. Jesus said to his disciples, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." They were a little confused by that, but he's the image of the Father. So in many ways, the Father sends the Son. Now, you'll see this liturgically. When the bishop's here, not only do we have nothing to do, we don't tell the deacon anything because the bishop is here. He's serving. So in many ways, the Father is also the source of the diaconate. Now, if you have ever seen a liturgy, whether hierarchical with the bishop or not, the one that moves the least is the bishop. He really doesn't really move around a lot. We don't move much either because there's really nothing to do, but we do a little bit of movement. The one who moves around the most is the deacon. He's at this side of the altar, he's at the other side of the altar, he's out. He's, turning to the people, he's turning to the front. In many ways, he operates like the Spirit operates, because also sent from the Father, not bound in the same ways by permanence that the Son has in his embodied form, because the Son, Jesus, is the incarnate image of his Father, made flesh. The Spirit isn't bound by flesh. The Spirit, Jesus says, goes where he wills. So it's a rough approximation. Don't take it as doctrine or dogma, but I think it's an interesting way of seeing that God, even through people, even through sinful people, that we all are, as clergy, still can operate, and in some ways operates the same way that he operates in himself, in the persons of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Let's see. Let's talk about qualifications. Qualifications. There's requirements and there's qualifications. Just because somebody may qualify doesn't mean that person is necessarily called to be bishop, priest, or deacon. In other words, there's a qualification and then there's a calling. When we get into issues of ordination and women's ordination, sometimes we misunderstand part of this because we say, well, what's the qualification? And again, we'll get into a little bit official leadership, unofficial leadership. But according to what the Orthodox Church has practiced, the qualifications are given for the two roles, at least early on in the New Testament, right in the writing of St. Paul. He talks about that the episcopos should be the husband of one wife. He should be his own house should be in good order. He gives several things there. So that can qualify someone. It doesn't mean that each of the people that qualify for that are called to it. God calls, who he's going to call. So there are qualifications. This issue of women's ordination is an interesting one because it's hard for us to understand the answer when back when all this was coming together over 2,000 years ago, the question would have been strange. Not the answer to the question, but the question would have been strange. Right? Why not have women as bishops, priests? Now we know there were women deacons. This is an absolute fact. We know from the New Testament there were women deacons. There were deacons, and the Greek is the feminine version of the male deacon. So deaconess is a very good translation. And we know they were, as there are some churches now sort of experimenting with bringing the female diaconate back. What we don't know is what did those deacons and deaconesses do? Right? We know that for the last 1,000 years or more, we know the liturgical role of the male deacons. Right? We have liturgical books. They don't say the deacon or the deaconess. It refers to the male deacon when he does liturgically. We do know that deaconesses had one very specific liturgical role, and that was to baptize the women converts. So they had a liturgical function that we're absolutely clear on. And why they had to do it was people were traditionally baptized naked. You're being born again. So you're going to be born into your life in God and the church, the same you were born physically. So you are baptized naked. And it was not seen appropriate that a naked woman would be in the presence of a man. And so the women deacons, the deaconesses, definitely had that liturgical function. But all of our research to date tells us that's all that we know they did. So research is continuing. We may find out someday that there was other things they did. My personal opinion is that deacons and deaconesses, most of what they did was not what we would call liturgical. All right. So it wasn't like when we say that the deacons serve the Eucharist, it's not like you see today where I hand the deacon a chalice and he distributes the Eucharist. It probably was, because we hear it in St. Paul's writings, that there was a dispute in the distribution among the widows and the orphans. And that in the distribution, there was an unfair distribution going on. In other words, I think what a lot was going on, both for the male and female diaconate, was what you and I would either call some kind of ministry or social work or outreach. It wasn't necessarily liturgical function. We know that the deacons had liturgical functions then. We know the deaconesses had a particular liturgical function. How much more than baptizing one, we don't know. There's nothing that we found yet. But the research is continuing. Let's see.
So,
Yeah.
so does that mean like, in just trying to think of the ancient church versus like what we do now, like a lot of the functions that we have, the extracurriculars beyond, divine liturgy and everything like that would probably have been like the diaconate kind of role, most likely. Like
That's my guess.
kind of like,
Because most of the thing it refers to, there's not a lot of information in the New Testament anyway, about what these functions did, we would call liturgically. They were still forming. I mean, they were still in the days of the New Testament, they're still worshiping in the Jewish temple. They're still going to synagogue. until they get kicked out. We also know they were gathering together for the Eucharist. But it's gonna be a while before they get actually kicked out of Judaism completely. And then what are they gonna do is they're gonna say, we need to transmit now what we had in our life of worship from our life in Judaism into this new life that they saw as not something new and different. They saw it as a continuation of their life in Judaism. Christ is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. But it wasn't until they actually stop and are barred from the temple and the synagogue that starts to happen. So early on, we don't have a lot. However, by the time, at least of St. Ignatius, around the year 100, we're talking now the end of the New Testament, we call it the Apostolic Age. Well, ironically, it's a time right after the Apostles. But the Apostolic Age, that's when we start to see liturgically what these roles are doing. And they're very clear things that are still done. What he describes happening, what others describe happening liturgically, is still what we see happening with the bishops, priests, and the deacons.
So the modern diaconate role kind of evolved hundreds of years after, like, year zero kind of thing.
Well, in some ways it evolved, in some ways we're reduced. Like right now, we're just now beginning to reinitiate's the wrong word, but renew a sense of the diaconate beyond the liturgical function. So even, let's say 30, 40 years ago, you might have a deacon and he serves the services and that's it. Right? Now we see that there are a lot of things that the deacons can do outside of the service, but we also see that there are a lot of things that non-deacon men and women are doing. My suspicion is that was a big part of the diaconate back then. Now we think of it as a separate thing. I don't think they would have thought it as separate. But again, we're talking about something happened 2,000 years ago. They're trying to piece it together. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier with the overseer or the bishop having being the husband of one wife, when the bishops aren't supposed to be married. I'm confused.
So our bishops were married until about the 6th century. Peter had a mother-in-law. Peter, who's considered the first bishop of Rome, also was a bishop at Antioch first. Until the 6th century, and to this day, there are no prohibitions in the Orthodox Church of having married bishops. There was never a council to decide it. It did drop out of practice, and a couple of reasons, both of them were, I don't know if logistical is a good word, but practical. All right. One is that because the bishop functions as the main authority in the church, it's in his name that all church property gets placed personally. Right now in America, we have corporate law. You can have a corporation that is not in any one person's name. Now it's a little bit different. But in most societies, you have to have a person that's the owner, operator of a certain property or a building, whatever. So all church properties are in the personal name of the bishop. And what you started seeing happening among some of the married bishops is that they are now bequeathing property that is officially theirs to their kids. But it's church property, right? And for us, we see a definition really clear. Well, that's personal, that's the church. In their mind, it was all theirs, but it was there to be the guardian for the community. So that was one tricky problem. You had some bishops bequeathing properties to their biological children, not their spiritual children. The other one is that in different points in history, see what happens, let's go back to the pre-apostolic age. The apostles function in many ways like mobile bishops. They travel around, they teach. What you see them doing is everywhere they go, they end up leaving somebody in charge. And that's where we get the modern idea of a local bishop. He's not going to travel. The apostle came through. The apostle put somebody in charge as the overseer. And then the apostle moves on. So the bishop, by definition, was pretty stable geographically. Typically, if there was a somewhat sizable town, the town had a bishop. and that bishop had elders working with presbyters and deacons. What happens over time is the territories that these bishops are governing end up getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Right? We don't currently have a bishop of our Diocese of Toledo, but our last bishop, Bishop Anthony, his diocese goes from Bowling Green, Kentucky, just across the state line from Tennessee, to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And from Minneapolis to Youngstown, Ohio. So big territory, right? Imagine what it's like. The life of a bishop is a traveling life. They are on the road. Most bishops are on the road 4 to 5 days a week, sometimes more. Every week in and week out, month in, month out, year in, year out. So try to do that as a family man, as a father. Those are the two main reasons it falls out of disuse. But who knows? Someday could that way of living be changed? Yeah, it could be. But with I think the legal thing that's easily solved these days with our very developed legal system. But you still have to figure out, how does this guy have a family? Let's talk very quickly, because then we're running out of time soon here. The role of the clergy in our lives. Well, for most of us, we're not going to see the bishop very often, again, because now they have bigger areas. He's going to travel around. You'll see him. Canonically, a bishop is supposed to visit each parish in his diocese twice a year. Practically speaking, the way they are now, that's too big. It's a problem. It's a problem that some people are starting to do some research and write about, saying we've got a problem in the most stable level of the clergy. You've got a problem when they're not living a stable life, living on the road. So there are people arguing now for more bishops, smaller areas, and a much more geographically centered life. So most of the time, we're not going to see the bishop very often. It's a big deal when he comes to town, because it's not very often, and he is the source. He's our main image for Christ, the main one bringing, revealing God to us. By the way, we've talked about who ordains a priest and a deacon. Who ordains a bishop? It is other bishops. Canonically, it takes 3, and the idea is 3 bishops have to agree that this next person will do what? Carry on what they've been doing. That they've tested him, they've quizzed him, they've checked the quality of his life, the quality of his character, and he is worthy to carry on the role of the bishop, because his main job, again, is the teacher. He has to transmit both to his presbyters, but to the church as a whole, the fullness of Christian teaching. So if you ever get a chance to see the consecration of bishops, it's a very rare occasion, but if you get a chance to see it, it's pretty cool, because they do this. It's all sort of ritualized now, and there's script for it. It's not sort of freewheeling, but they quiz him liturgically, they quiz him theologically, they quiz him historically, to make sure that he can represent that entire line that he's coming from. He's in that apostolic line that goes back to the apostles themselves. And so, anyway, so that's the bishop. Mostly because the bishop is traveling, most people are going to interact. Their main contact with the clergy is going to be with the elder, the priest. In most cases, it's a parish priest. For people living in monasteries, they will have an abbot or an abbess, depending on if it's a woman's or a man's monastery. But they'll also have typically a presbyter there to administer the sacraments and lead the liturgical services. So all of this becomes not so much theological and theoretical, but it comes practically lived. That what's the role of the priest, the presbyter? He is to be your guide into a life in God. Not because of his own perfection, we are not perfect. Not because we are so smart, we're not very smart. But hopefully the church has chosen us and said that we're worthy of the role because of our at least somewhat ability to be teachers, guides, shepherds, people who can lead people in their spiritual journey. We don't ask or even encourage blind obedience, but we do suggest people follow a level of obedience, because if the presbyter is just a sort of figurehead, well, then we're back to having chaos. Everyone's doing it their own way. So the idea is that you live in obedience to your priest. Again, he's not there to rule your life, right? He's not responsible for the car you buy or the house you live in. So you don't need to get his blessing to do that. But he is the one that's your main source of guidance in your spiritual life. So that's the one that you typically want to go and ask direction of, for whether it's a rule of prayer or how you're dealing with a certain temptation or struggle. He's the one that's there. But again, what's his purpose? To unite us to God. He's not there to be a block. He's not there to be a go-between. He's not there to be a division. He's there to unite us to God. I think, and I will speak not as a priest, I will speak as somebody who has a priest in my life who has a spiritual father. The clergy, having clergy, is one of the greatest gifts God has given to the church. Not every Christian body has this, and I think those that don't are missing out, because when I need guidance in my spiritual life, I don't just go paging through the Bible. I can do that. I don't just go paging the fathers. I can do that. I can actually, in these days anyway, dial a phone and call somebody. The old days when you wrote a letter, you went for a visit. And am I going to take that as gospel truth? No. But I'm going to take it as guidance that I'm going to weigh very, very heavily, because that's his job. His job is to guide me. He's not there to frustrate me. Your priest will on occasion frustrate you. By definition. Why? Because he's not there to keep you happy. He's not there to say what you want to hear. He's there to say what you need to hear. And that's why if your priest doesn't frustrate you from time to time, you're not listening closely enough. So that's what we're there to do. All right, that's our time. We got most of it in. I'll keep it over for one or two questions quick.
One is because North America is so big as far as like how much jurisdiction bishop has. Do they have this issue in Europe too, or like
Yeah,
stuff like that?
but what tends to happen is over time, it develops to the point where you do get more stable eventually. The problem is in Christian history, anytime we started to get stability, that was always interrupted at some point with widespread persecution. So probably the greatest example is the Soviet Union and all the Eastern Bloc countries, all the formerly communist countries, some still somewhat communist, but anyway, they're struggling now to rebuild what was built over centuries. And because it was so developed, but then it was so decimated, like we just, I heard a couple days ago, Archbishop Anastasios, who was the bishop in Albania. Albania was the most persecuted country in Europe. He just died at the age of 95. He went to Albania, I want to say 30-ish years ago. When he got there as a relatively young bishop, there were 4 priests in the country, the entire country, all over the age of 80. And this is a country with lots and lots of dioceses and hundreds of parishes. And he's supposed to guide this church that has all this, well, had been decimated by persecution. So now the country has been, the church largely rebuilt, but still, it's still an ongoing effort. So yeah, the longer a church is allowed to develop, the more healthy it tends to be over time, because you have time to build those structures, to raise up those leaders, to build the building, the churches and all that. But it's centuries. So we're still relatively new. Our people, we've been in this country for a little more than 200 years. But in large numbers, we've really been here for 70 or 80. Still relative. I mean, our church is 103 years old. And we're one of the oldest churches in the country. So yeah, eventually they tend to be more developed, smaller areas. Anybody else? All right, I'll let you go. Nice to have you all. And if you want to stick around and ask questions, happy to do that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.